of people who don't want to be pregnant. In my reporting, when Donald Trump took the presidency in 2016, I heard from anti-abortion activists that he was going to be the most pro-life president the country had ever seen. And at the March for Life that year, it was sort of a common refrain among attendees that that was the last March for Life they would ever have to have. Of course, that event continues every year, but basically they were right. And the anti-abortion right has been emboldened by the conservative majority that Trump installed on the Supreme Court. So it's really just open season for the right, where they don't see their goal of banning abortion as constrained by the Constitution anymore or by Supreme Court precedent, because they know that the current court is ready to do their bidding. And as you said, Dr. Jones, seemingly ready to overturn that precedent. The issue or the case that the Supreme Court is preparing to issue a decision on, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, concerns a Mississippi ban on abortions performed after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And it would be a massive surprise if the court did not take that opportunity to, at the very least, take a few bites out of Roe. So we find ourselves at what could very well be the end of Roe v. Wade and the beginning of a new era of patchwork abortion policy in the US, where people who live in the right states or have the right connections or have a lot of money can probably access abortion care. But anyone who doesn't, people who can't afford to travel or people who are undocumented and have a hard time crossing state lines, people with children they can't leave at home. As we know, the majority of people who get abortions do have children already, or even people who don't have the resources to find the information that they need to figure that all out. They will no longer have the freedom to choose when and whether and how to bear children. I've talked to abortion rights providers in Texas and in surrounding states over the past few months, and they tell me it's a human rights crisis in the making. And that, we hear a lot of stories, sort of tales of heroism, basically, of people helping women from Texas travel to other states to get the abortions they need. But abortion providers tell me that a much more common story is someone comes in for an abortion. They find that they're too far along in their pregnancy to get a legal abortion in Texas. And they're frozen, they're surprised, and they leave without making a plan. And abortion providers don't know what happens to them. So if and when the Supreme Court allows other states to pass such bans, this will have follow-on effects in poverty and education and gender equality. The list goes on for generations to come. So in other words, this discussion we're having today couldn't come at a more urgent time. And I am thrilled and honored to be here with 4 distinguished Christian leaders and theologians to talk about the faith-based case for abortion rights and how, on this issue, Christianity has been manipulated by the right to its own political ends. So we're joined today by Dr. Monica A. Coleman, Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. Welcome, Dr. Coleman. Jamie Manson is the president of Catholics for Choice. Welcome, Jamie. And Dr. Rebecca Todd Peters is a professor of religious studies and the director of the Poverty and Social Justice program at Elon University. Thank you all for joining us. So before we get into the affirmative case for abortion rights, I'd love to start with the political roots of the issue in the US. And I'm wondering, Dr. Jones, if you can give us a little bit of historical context. How did we end up where we are today with the Republican Party and conservative faith leaders sort of banding together in this push to ban abortion?
Yes, and that's a great question. And there's a 2,000-year answer to that. There's also a 200-year answer to that. What I want to focus on today is really a very recent answer to that question that surprises most people, because I think the perception is that the anti-abortion crusade that is predominantly led by white evangelical conservative communities is actually a very new phenomena. Just a few decades ago, evangelical Christians across the board expressed support for abortion protections, or if not support, they were at times ambivalent to the issue. For example, in 1967, there's an evangelical magazine called Christian Life. And in this Christian Life, they went after Catholics, and Jamie, it'll be interesting to hear your response to this. They went after Catholics for their non-biblical stance on reproductive rights, stating the Bible definitely pinpoints a difference in the value of a fetus and an adult. Thus, the Bible would appear to disagree with the official Catholic view that the tiniest fetus is as important as an adult human being. This was a pervasive evangelical view.
Wow.
In 1970, 70% of Baptist pastors supported abortion to protect a mother's mental or physical health. And in the late 70s, 1976, 1977, 1979, this is the one that just blows me away. The Southern Baptist Convention issued national resolutions stating that they affirmed their conviction about the limited role of government in dealing with matters related to abortion. This is in writing. This was pronounced and publicized. So what changed? Well, I think just to cut to the chase of the matter, a strategic and political, not theological or moral, decision was made that the abortion issue could become a wedge issue because they were beginning to see, in the context of desegregation, political conservatives who were alarmed by this and decided to fire up the case around abortion, literally creating the issue as a religious issue in the evangelical community. It checked all the boxes, and a national movement emerged dedicated to stopping the practice. And, you know, one way of putting this is, in short, this very recent decision is a racist and a strategic, again, not a moral or theological decision. And it's no accident that at this point, anti-abortion policies supported by the Christian right are stronger in states where the Christian right is also supporting restrictions on voting rights, access to healthcare, and anti-poverty legislation. It's like a Christian right package deal with abortion at the forefront of it.
Yeah, I mean, the intersection of all those issues, I think, is important when we're talking about how to fight it with especially with theological arguments. Dr. Coleman, how does liberation theology support the fight for reproductive justice? And you know, I know reproductive justice is a much broader fight. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that term too.
Well, I'm glad you asked it that way. That's how I hope to answer it. First, you know, the core of liberation theology states that, you know, God is against oppression, right? Because God is also for, you know, a good quality of life. You know, most of my work centers from womanist theology. And one of the kind of groundbreaking ways that former Union Seminary professor Dolores Williams talked about the experiences of African-American women was through issues of reproductive health. And that one of the significant ways in which African-American women, and you can add many women of color in this country, have been oppressed is through their reproductive health system, right? Whether that is through forced pregnancies, right? Like what she called forced surrogacy, or through forced sterility, right? And these have been legal, and these are literally exactly the ways in which Puerto Ricanas, Latinas, Native American women of various nations, and African-American women have been oppressed. And so liberation theology would say, well, first of all, that's a problem, right? So is that God wants you to be liberated around the areas in which you have been oppressed. But it's not just for the sake of countering oppression, right? Because it's also about quality of life. And Dr. Jones just said it very well, that so much of the conversation on abortion is about birth and not about life. Right. And, you know, one of, a New Testament scripture says, you know, Jesus says, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And so much of these conversations are tied to not wanting everyone to have abundant life, actually putting structures in place so that only a small percentage of people have agency and quality of life, and not thinking about, well, what about the well-being of young people? What about the well-being of women? What about the well-being of families? About love, about poverty, about access, right? And so much of reproductive justice, right, isn't really even just about abortion, right? It's about our entire reproductive health lives. And for women, that starts pretty early and goes pretty long, right? In terms of what do we know about our bodies? How are our bodies changing? Like every 5 years, something major happens, right? In terms of one's reproductive health system. And are we informed about these things? Do we have access to care for that? Of course, God wants us to care for our bodies, right? We talk about our bodies as being temples of the Holy Spirit. And so agency around when to birth and how to birth is just a smaller part of a larger conversation about health, about wellness, about agency, about access to healthcare, which we also know takes a great amount of privilege in this country to have access to good healthcare. And abortion is one very extreme example of that. But to get most kinds of healthcare, you have to have a good amount of privilege. To get most quality healthcare, right, you have to have a good amount of privilege, whether that's knowledge-based privilege or income and wealth-based privilege and access privilege. And, God, of course, is like, no, this is not something that's for just a couple people get to be healthy and everyone else doesn't get to be healthy. There's nothing in our tradition that suggests that that's what God is about, but rather we should all get to be healthy. We should all get to make decisions about how we want to live, right? And being able to live with everything that we need, let alone some other things that might make our life well.
I love that distinction that you drew between birth and life. I think that really cuts to the core of the issue. Jamie, then the history that Dr. Jones so wonderfully, concisely laid out for us, there's a clear distinction here between evangelical communities and Catholic communities. What is unique about the role of Catholics in this fight for reproductive freedom?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's so important to tell people, especially non-Catholic audience, is just how extreme the Catholic Church's position is on reproductive health. Not only is there an absolute ban on abortion with no exceptions, there's also an absolute ban on all artificial contraceptives, tubal ligations, vasectomies, IVF, any kind of reproductive fertility treatments. I mean, so this is really so right-wing, this position. And I really don't think you can underestimate that. And so you have this huge religious group with this very, very hard right, position on reproductive health that also has a lot of power over the medical system. 1 in 6 hospital beds in the United States belongs to the Catholic Church, is owned by them. So it's really powerful. The other thing that's important to remember, I think, is that none of these doctrines were developed or influenced by or written by anyone that had a uterus. This is purely the invention of men, and not just men, but men who ostensibly say they are celibate. And so they have absolutely no inroads into the life of women. No wives, no daughters. Obviously, we have an absolute ban on the ordination of women. So they're not colleagues. Women are not colleagues to the hierarchy. So it's so important to take a look at that. Now, the irony is the majority of Catholics support abortion rights. 68% of US Catholics do not want to see Roe versus Wade struck down. 56% think abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So we have kind of a landslide victory for Catholic support for abortion. But to me, the even more dramatic number of all these statistics is that 1 in 4 abortion patients in the United States identifies as Catholic. That means that abortion is part of the life of the church. These are the people who are in the pew next to you, the woman who is reading the scripture, the person who's teaching you your kids' Sunday school has very likely had an abortion. The women who are cleaning the priests, washing their dishes and mending their vestments have probably had abortions. And we have a hierarchy that's calling them murderers. And so you have this incredible, incredible delta. in the experience, and a church that just wants to ignore the fact that this is part of the fabric of the life of our church. So I think that why this is so uniquely important to Catholics, other than all these other reasons, is that the Catholic Church started this whole mess, really. This is Catholic ideology that we are fighting against. All these ideas of the ensoulment and personhood, and all of these ideas that right-wing forces want to weave into our civil law. These are all Catholic ideas. And so I feel that Catholics have a moral obligation to speak up about it, especially since we're apparently pro-choice Catholics are in the majority. The problem is that it is so taboo in Catholic spaces that even very progressive Catholics will not speak about it. For example, like the nuns on the bus, that everybody loved the nuns on the bus, fighting for poverty, fighting against poverty, fighting for healthcare. And then at the same time saying abortion's not our issue. Meanwhile, the intersections between poverty and healthcare and abortion are so profound. And so it just shows how important it is that Catholics have to speak up. They have enormous political influence. And we have a hierarchy that is constantly either in the Supreme Court fighting to take away the civil right of the year that they're fighting to take away every year. They're in the court, and the overreach in general of the hierarchy with the millions they spend on lobbying and anti-abortion efforts. So we really have an obligation to embolden our voices.
Yeah, I would add, you mentioned the fact that there's a large Catholic presence in healthcare. There's a well-established network of Catholic education systems too. And, it's very clear to anyone who's been to, pro-life rally that Catholic schools, Catholic colleges are very, very plugged into the anti-abortion activist movement. Dr. Peters, you've written about Christian communities that believe abortion should be legal, but in certain circumstances, usually in cases of rape or incest or severe health concerns for the pregnant person or the fetus. And that corresponds to what I see on the secular side as a really easy trap that people who support abortion rights can fall into, which is framing the argument against abortion bans by invoking women who are in, broadly sympathetic situations. So how do Christian leaders make the affirmative case for abortion in other situations for people who don't want to be pregnant for any other number of reasons?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And I think it's important to recognize sort of the piece that you've described there, right? So I call those prim abortions. So those are prenatal health issues, rape, incest, and the mother's life. So those are the reasons historically that people across the country, religious people, secular people, feel like abortion is okay, that it's justified, right? And so in my analysis of the abortion debate, I argue that this justification framework requiring women to offer acceptable justification in order to elicit our sympathy, our support, is itself a stigmatizing and damaging framework. And that's the framework within which our political conversation is happening. That's the framework that we think theologically, can someone justify their decision? And it's that frame, until we get rid of that framework and the way we talk about it, we're going to be stuck in just a no-win argument, right? So I think that's why we need a new framing. And I have, been inspired and learned from the reproductive justice movement, a movement that was started in 1994 by 12 Black women and then carried forward in this country by women of color who have really argued for what the rest of us need to do, which is stop fixating on abortion and recognize that abortion is an experience within the larger reproductive lives of women that Monica was talking about, right? So we have these large, roughly 30 years women are fertile, right? And we know that women spend about 3 years pregnant, nursing, or trying to get pregnant. So that leaves 27 plus years that women are trying not to get pregnant. And so I think that this need to have a theological reframing is part of it, but it's a broader and it's a counter to the fact that the current framing is a Christian framing, right? That justification framework very clearly, as Jamie was talking about, is coming out of a historically Catholic and Christian context. The final point I want to make in line with Jamie's comments about people without uteruses making all these laws, we have had no history, virtually no history of a theology of gestation, right? There is no conversation about what is happening during the gestation process. This is a sui generis experience. What is happening there is not like anything else in human life, right? So we have simply not had those theological conversations yet. And that is a large part of the work that I am interested in trying to do with people, is to talk about what is unique and different about, because, I have 2 children. I had 2 great pregnancies. I love my kids. I love my family. Christians love families, right? That's not the problem. The problem is the way in which we're saying that this thing that is happening, this gestation process, this developing prenate, is equivalent in all ways to a living baby that has been born, right? And so we need much more theological discourse and discussion to recognize that there's a difference, right? We have the Exodus text that talks about that difference. It's not as if there isn't conversation that has happened. It just hasn't happened in robust feminist and womanist ways that I hope we will continue to move forward with.
Yeah, you mentioned, the subjectivity of these teachings that were, by and large written by men. And I think about the Bible in those terms too, and the fact that women are often portrayed in the Bible actually almost exclusively through the lens of their sexuality, their ability or inability to bear children. Do you think that still has a lasting impact on the way, mainstream religious teachings think about something like pregnancy and birth?
Absolutely. And I think it clearly does, but I also think it's important to recognize that the cultural history and impact of Christianity means that we're all thinking about it that way, right? It isn't just Christians who have embodied these ideas about misogyny and patriarchy and women as, virgins or whores or mothers, right? I mean, that is the underlying cultural idea that is shaping anti-choice perspectives and the desire to control women's bodies, women's sexuality.
Yeah. I know the push to ban abortion has been a real success story for the right in terms of bringing people into the movement, seizing political power. And I'm wondering if any of you have seen it function the other way around too, in terms of keeping people engaged in conservative churches or faith communities, especially as, in this time of declining religious participation.
I mean, I can say, there have been, and I'm sure it's still ongoing, in African-American churches, right, who have identified as more theologically conservative, aligning with anti-abortion politics, even though everything else in the political framework is historically and currently to the detriment of the well-being of African-Americans, right? But they'll kind of hold on to this one issue and say, oh, this is our religious issue. And my religion says, this only particular school of theology, and you'll see this particularly with these very large mega churches that have a more evangelical or fundamental religious perspective. And then it will undo everything else that African Americans have historically, and some might even claim currently, to care about in terms of social justice, right? And very much going back to Dr. Jones talking about voting rights even being connected, right, to to the issue of abortion and healthcare, right? When we're like, no, we know we need healthcare, we know we need voting rights, but we're going to vote against all that because of this one issue. And so I think it definitely has happened in that way. And it's painfully tragic to me, from my perspective.
Is there a corollary to that on the left? You know, how successful have progressive voices been on the religious left on this issue? And you know, this is a question for anyone.
So I like to think about, well, I mean, you already commented about the success that the right has had on this issue, and that didn't happen overnight. You know, Dr. Jones talked about the history of that, and while those beliefs have been, you know, really created in the last 50 years, they have also been promulgated deeply across those evangelical spaces and Catholic spaces. I mean, talk about the number of Catholic churches I've gone in that have literature right there. I mean, and this is in local churches across the country, so that it has been a grassroots movement to convince people that this is the issue that should define their lives, should shape their voting. And it's been decades of work that they have engaged in, you know, creating this position, this you know, ideology, and shaping it to their political interests. And so I think it's helpful and encouraging to recognize the way in which grassroots communities across the country embraced LGBT issues as they adopted congregational designations as more light churches or open and affirming churches, and began to talk at the local level about LGBT issues and their family members and their experience. And that reframed that issue for many people. And that also took many, many years. And so there are a group of progressive Christians, actually it's an interfaith group, Jews and Unitarians and others who are in the midst of creating a congregational designation for churches, that we're writing an 8-week study curriculum that churches will go through that really talks about sexuality in the broad ways that an RJ frame does, not just talking about abortion, because we don't talk about sexuality and healthy sexuality in churches. And that is work that needs to be done in every local church across the country. And I think that is the work of decades. You know, culture change takes a long time, and you know, quite frankly, I think a lot of progressives, Christian and secular, have taken Roe v. Wade for granted. We thought we won this, and that this would not, we wouldn't be where we are now. But until we reframe that whole justification idea and reframe how we think about women's sexuality and women's health and reproduction and family and childbearing, and caring for children once they're born, until we make those shifts culturally, we're going to continue to be beating our head against a wall.
And you know, I just everyone has made in some way this same point, but there's this very odd characteristic of the abortion conversation in conservative, evangelical, and Catholic communities, in that even in those communities, if asked confidentially, the majority of people support abortion. And if asked confidentially, an even larger number have had abortions. But if you ask them how they would vote on this, they would vote anti-abortion. So there's a huge disconnect between practice, what you actually think about policy, and how you're making your political decision in the voting booth. And somehow we have to make better sense of what's going on with all of that. Particularly this discrepancy between your position and your willingness to get an abortion and how you would actually act on a policy level.
Right. And,
you know, and Dr. Jones, I suspect some of that is because those people know that no matter how the law turns out, they'll still have access, right? That they have enough privilege, enough money, enough, you know, information, that even if the law goes the other way, they and people they're connected to will still be able to get access to what they want. And so in some ways, it's just a deep selfishness. I mean, is that too mean to say? Right? That
I would
just, you know what's
interesting?
Yeah. I think that's true, but also in the recent statistic is it's closer like 68% of Black evangelicals support abortion. but that would not, if asked in confidence, but that would not necessarily play itself out in voting patterns around the issue. So I'm not clear exactly what's going on. I mean, it's always the case when it comes to the relationship between belief and practice, that you can practice something very different than what you actually confess to believe. And that's sort of,
And I think that's really, so I'm also part of a study, a multi-faith study with Jewish and Catholic and Muslim, Black Protestant and myself, scholars who are interviewing women having abortions, religious women having abortions right now. And one of the things we're finding is this personal exceptionalism, to your point, that they will say abortion is wrong, except for me, except for this circumstance, except for this case. And it's remarkable. And I've seen other studies that have borne that out as well, that it's one of the reasons we're really digging into this, to try to figure out exactly what you're asking and what's going on here. And in what way is cultural stigma impacting how people are thinking about this issue, as well as the ways in which religious theological beliefs are shaping people's decision making.
Yeah, and there's another discrepancy that I would sort of add to that category, which is the difference between being personally opposed to abortion, maybe I wouldn't get an abortion for myself, and thinking I have the right to make that decision for everybody else. And I think that's sort of the driving impulse, or the driving difference when it comes to voting patterns, because it's, and whether abortion is the most important issue for people. There's more people, historically, there's been more people on the right than the left who say that abortion is their reason for making their choice in the voting booth. I've noticed too that discussions around religion and abortion often focus on the morality or immorality of the actual act of abortion, and whether terminating a pregnancy is a morally permissible thing to do. I actually think it's pretty hard to change hearts and minds on that issue. I think a lot of people know what they feel and know what they think, but I'm wondering if there's a way of reframing it around these bans on abortion, and whether it's morally permissible to force an unwilling person to carry a pregnancy and to endure childbirth. I'm wondering if any of you, if there's any sort of theological gloss any of you can add to that framework, because when I believe it was Dr. Coleman, you mentioned the sanctity of the body and the body as a temple, and it would seem to me that these bans would be contravening that idea.
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, even if you go as basic as a kind of golden rule, right, to do unto others as you would have them, right, do unto you, because you have to say that in the King James, right, to make it sound holy. Is nobody wants someone else making decisions for them, right? So just generally speaking, no, that doesn't feel good. Like my 3-year-old child, when she was 3, didn't want me making decisions for her, right? Like pretty early on, you were like, I want to do my own thing. And you want to make decisions for yourself. And so it is, I would say, sinful, right? Because it goes against the core theological principle to make decisions for somebody else, in that sense. And we can apply that to all types, right, of areas. But, when we had the conversation about, this is what I would do, I think it's really a theory and practice issue again, because in all areas of reproductive health, most people don't know what they would do until they're in that situation. What would you do if you're, menstruating and you don't have access to menstrual pads or tampons, right? What would you do? You don't know till you're there. What would you do if you spent years trying not to get pregnant, then you want to get pregnant and you can't get pregnant, right? What would you do if this, and this? I mean, there are all types. What would you do if you hit menopause at 35? All these different kinds of things. Most of us just kind of wouldn't know what we would do. And everyone assumes their lives are going to be normal, healthy, whatever that means, right? Which is simply not the case for most people. And it takes out the fact that childbirth in its best circumstances still is incredibly dangerous for women of color, right? Even if you're in a hospital, right? If you're, Serena Williams, right? That surviving childbirth for Black women and for women of color is not a given. And that's with money, and that's with privilege, and that's in, an expensive hospital, right? That there are still so many challenges and discrepancies about that to force someone is not just about a baby, right? It's actually about a much larger constellation of issues.
Yeah, and I would also want to follow up. I think I completely agree with what you're saying in this issue it's the wrong, I would argue, is the wrong question, right? So the way, Christina, that you framed this, I think you're absolutely right. That's the way that it's framed culturally. Is abortion right or wrong? But what I argue is it's the wrong question, right? And Monica has talked about the question that women actually encounter is when they have an unplanned, unwanted, or problem pregnancy, what should I do? That's the real moral question. That's the moral question that women are asking and that they have to navigate. This question of is abortion right or wrong is an abstract question. It's a patriarchal question. It's a question that is decontextualized from the circumstances. And I would also maybe disagree with you, Christina, to say that people aren't going to change their mind on that. They know where they are, because people have changed their mind on LGBT issues. 50 years ago, someone might have said the exact same thing. Nobody's going to change their mind on the issue. They know what they believe and they know where they stand on that. And I think that people may feel very strongly, but they're also not talking about this issue in any kind of nuanced or complicated way. And I think that when we open up those conversations and we talk about some of the things that Monica has raised around Black women's health and around, sort of access to contraception or access to maternal care or the capacity to raise the children that you already have, right? 60% of women having abortions already have at least one child, right? I think that the tropes and stereotypes about women who have abortions are so strong in this country that abstract question of is abortion right or wrong, no one is engaging in any meaningful way. So that, yes, there are people who think that they know what they believe in very strong ways, but I think it's because we aren't having deep, ethically rich conversations.
That's a good, sorry, go ahead.
I also just wanted to add to that I do think that in the context of making choices about your whole reproductive life, we have to also acknowledge that for many women, it is not framed primarily as an ethical or moral issue. And they're not wrestling with it ethically or morally. It's a pragmatic issue. So that has to be just acknowledged as part of the conversation. Other thing I just wanted to add is the studies that have been coming out recently on the epigenetic impact of intergenerational trauma on particularly Black and brown women's bodies with respect to their reproductive life are just shocking. And I think as we begin to sort of take in what happens intergenerationally around all of this, it's going to become even clearer in this way that is horrifying, that the history of enslavement, literally owning women's bodies, is still coming back in the form of the state, again, trying to own the process. But the trauma itself over time has really dramatically impacted the fertility of women of color, and their health, their maternal health, or their ability to survive a pregnancy. So it's.
And what's almost a little ironic about that is that there are traditions outside of Christianity that have been talking about this, right? In terms of Indigenous and Black and brown women's bodies and the impact, right, of generational trauma on one's physical health. And they've, for reasons of both desire and necessity, sought spiritual responses to that because those were more accessible and because it was part of the deep belief. And so even, with the Christian culture around these ideas, part of it's that basic freedom of religion, that not everyone is Christian, right? So, when you make a law for a country that claims to have freedom of religion is based on one kind of Christian interpretation of things, it negates that reasoning is not compelling for not even all Christians, but for people who aren't Christians who are still in this country.
Yeah. We have so many good questions from the people, our audience in this panel. I want to try to mush a few of them into one question because we don't have time for all of them, but there's been a couple different questions about the theological foundation for abortion rights and moving it away from simply a political left versus right issue to something that is basically being able to inject religion and faith and theology into the argument for abortion rights. What advice would you give to somebody, I guess, who wants to find space for that kind of conversation in the abortion rights debate?
I can speak to that as a Catholic. One of my greatest frustrations is that we have these incredible resources in the Catholic tradition to actually make a great case for a Catholic support of abortion, and we don't use them. The first one is, of course, our notion of the primacy of conscience, an individual conscience, and that conscience, and this is in the catechism, is the final, individual conscience is the final arbiter in all moral decision making. So you can, in good conscience, go against church teaching. If that inner voice that God has given us, that spark of light, tells us to do so. So we have that. The other piece we have is this exceptional social justice tradition. One of the things I still love about the Catholic Church and why I still call myself a Catholic. And it has some amazing parallels actually to the reproductive justice framework. And so very often when I enter into conversation with Catholics, I'll use those two. The reproductive justice framework is enormously helpful because we share so many mutual strengths in showing people that this is a much bigger issue and part of maternal mortality and health and poverty and all of these things. And so it's really, really powerful. And when we also have incredible theological thinking about human dignity, and again, forcing someone to give birth, how is that human dignity? How does that honor someone's human dignity? So we have incredible resources in our traditions to use. We just haven't done it. And I think that with things becoming as dire as they are, I'm hoping theologians will step up. I'm hoping ordinary Catholics will step up. And we at Catholics for Choice are definitely doing that work now to frame these issues in that way, using good Catholic teaching and the tradition.
And I mean, if you look at the right that calls itself pro-life, I mean, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's almost cliche to point out at this point. The Republican Party is not pro-life. And I think there is a lot of space for reclaiming that moral authority. And not necessarily, I mean, it's great messaging on their part, but the sanctity of life, as so many of you have mentioned, is about so much more than fetal issues. I've been reading a little bit about, or I've been thinking about, I guess, what a progressive response to abortion bans looks like in a post-Roe era, especially with the current makeup of the judicial branch. I see a possibility for a shift in resources, maybe away from political advocacy, which will have diminishing returns and already has diminishing returns, and toward direct service, where there will be a much greater need for that as it becomes more difficult to get an abortion. And I've been reading about the clergy consultation service on abortion. I'm sure many of you know of this group, but I only learned about it recently. It was a group of more than 1,000 clergy members who came together in the 1960s to help women get safe abortion care, especially in places where it was illegal. More broadly, obviously, religious groups have been on the front lines of service provision for people in need. And I would love to hear from any of you, what role might progressive faith leaders play in the US after, or if and when Roe falls?
So I would just jump in here again with the Sacred Congregations movement. There is a clergy reboot of the clergy consultation service that is in the works, and that is merging in with the Sacred Congregation work, because this is all of a piece of what congregations and faith leaders need to be doing. And so I think that work will happen on different levels depending on people's capacity, depending on your faith leaders' capacity, depending on the congregations that they're serving and how outspoken they can be. So, I mean, I think there will be people who will be doing this work and outspoken about it. I think there will be people who will be doing this work and doing it quietly. And I think there will be people who will help facilitate this work being done. And I think that there is a place for everyone in the work, and that we're going to need people in communities across the country. I think that there's so much faith leaders could be doing. I sit on the Planned Parenthood board of my local affiliate, and one of the things that we have been doing is lobbying, particularly in the South, state senators who are also clergy people, who are voting on these bills at the state level. We need clergy who are prepared to lobby their fellow clergy people who are sitting in those spaces. And we need clergy who are able to make theological arguments with aplomb to say, this is where we need to be moving as a country. And, many of those arguments may very well be theological, but I think the importance is that theological people are making them in the space where the conversation has been framed and masked, right? So, there are a lot of Catholics and evangelicals are more likely to make explicitly theological claims, but a lot of these claims are being given a veneer of secularism to attempt to hide the theological basis for them that is there. And I think it's important both to expose that, but also to have prepared leaders in faith communities who can both help women get access when it's shut off in their states, lead their own communities in these important conversations we need to be having, and be public voices in public spaces around these issues.
Yeah. I could talk forever about this, but I want to give each of you the chance to offer some closing remarks, since I'm sure there are just so many questions I haven't asked you that you wish I did. Dr. Coleman, why don't we start with you?
The core of another core of liberation theology is the belief that the pursuit of justice is not ancillary to one's faith, but is a necessary outgrowth of one's faith. And as we've had this conversation, I just keep thinking that so much of the problem is patriarchy. It's like this comfort with believing that women are reducible, that their worth is reducible to their ability to have children. And that is just a patriarchal problem. And that it is part of one's Christian faith to resist anti-Blackness, to resist patriarchy, to resist white supremacy, to resist capitalism, right? To resist these forces that are limiting and oppressive and death dealing to people of God, right? To all people, which we would say, if you're a Christian, you believe all people are people of God, right? To God's creation. And so on a very basic level, it is our, faithful responsibility to not just look at one of these issues or this one issue of abortion, but to think about, what does it really mean to resist patriarchy, to treat women as whole human beings across the board. And of course, that's very threatening to male consolidated power. But it's not like it's only men that do this, right? These are large ideas that are embedded in our culture and in so many of us in many ways. But that is part of our job to preach about it, to preach against this, right? To speak against this, to teach against this, and literally take actions that are going to support the full humanity, the full divinity, right, of all of creation. And in this case, especially, women and those who are also identify as non-binary.
Thank you. Jamie.
I want to speak first from the perspective of a queer woman and just name that. I know we see I've seen the LGBTQ issue make enormous transformations and strides in the 15 years I've been out in Catholic spaces. But I think that it's dangerous to make an equivalency there. Because one of the reasons LGBTQ people got rights as fast as they did is because white men's rights were on the line. And people care. People care about Pete Buttigieg and Chasten. They really care. It's very good. Right. the struggle with abortion is primarily a woman's issue, and it disproportionately impacts women of color. And as someone who also on the side rallies for the Equal Rights Amendment, I can tell you how hard it is to get people excited about women's equality. And so I think that we have to name that, and especially with what Monica is saying about a patriarchy. So that's a really important point I wanted to make sure I got across. But I do the work I do because people are suffering. That is why I do this work. And I think that most of America is not prepared for a post-Roe world. I don't think they believe this is going to happen. I think we're in denial about it. I think we don't think this can happen in the United States. And when it does happen, because it almost surely will, people are going to be shocked and they're not going to know what to do. And there's going to be a lot of energy in that moment. And I'm really hoping that this is the moment where people of faith who support abortion rights really embolden themselves and start to speak out, because we have got to reclaim that narrative from the Christian right wing, the white supremacist Christian nationalist wing, that says that anyone who supports abortion rights is godless, because it's just not true. And, you're right, Christina, that this anti-abortion movement lost all of its credibility when it had Donald Trump speak at the March for Life. It lost all of its credibility. We have the moral high ground here, and we need to start claiming it. And so that I hope is the work that we can all do together. Is we have to get voices of faith together. We have to get progressive Christian voices of faith who are terrified of speaking about abortion or feel icky, and have those deep conversations with them one-on-one about that hesitance and why this is part of a social justice framework.
Thank you, Jamie. Dr. Peterson?
Yes, thank you. So, I was trained at Union. I consider myself a feminist liberation ethicist. And I do this work because of the things that Monica and Jamie have just identified, that, over the last 10 years, abortion, the numbers of abortions have fallen, but they have increased for poor women and for women who are at the most at the margins. And those are the women who are going to be most directly impacted in negative ways by what's happening right now. And so, what are the theological arguments? There are so many theological arguments. There are theological arguments about justice. There are theological arguments about, parenting as a sacred task. There are theological arguments about, women as created in the image of God and having the capacity to make the decisions that shape their lives. There are so many different ways that we can talk about this differently. And I think that what I hope this will generate in congregations across the country is an expansion of our conversation about sexuality and sexual health and families and reproductive decision making, and recognizing that there are many, many people who are making all kinds of situations where they're having to make decisions about their bodies and their lives and their sexuality and their health, and that churches and faith communities should be there in ways that we are not. And that is on us. And we really need to figure out how to step into this space in ways that move us toward justice.
Thank you, Dr. Peters. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Jones.
Just absolutely thank you for everything that has just been said, exclamation points and yeses around it all. The only thing I would just add to it, and I know it's there in what everyone said, is that I know about Jamie's teachers and Tottie's teachers. I know who they were because I was studying with them too. Those teachers in theological education on this specific issue make a huge difference in terms of people's capacities to understand how to frame it theologically, and even how to frame it theologically so that you can allow for pragmatic responses that aren't necessarily theological responses from non-theological audiences of people. I want to say thank you to everybody. Monica, Jamie, Toddy, what brilliance and what commitment and insight, and Christina, thank you for moderating our conversation and for the wholehearted way in which you have stepped into these deep and important waters. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. There will be more to come on this. I know that there is a consortium of seminaries who are organizing upcoming panels similar to this. And I think you will be hearing more in the days and weeks ahead from the faith communities across the country in an interfaith context about this issue as it continues to rise to the top of our concerns and consciousness. So thank you all. Have a good day.